Māori e koutou, ki te mana whenua, Ngāti Mani o Poto, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko hana nui te mauka, ko te ara kiwa te moana, ko murihuku te whenua, ko nai tahu kati mamoe me waitaha o kuiwi, ko Rata tōku ingoa, and I am a kairangaho at Kitson Consulting. As a little bit of background to this mahi, Jane Kitson, our sort of big boss director, was involved as a technical expert in the Southland Land and Water Plan, and their role was pulling together all this information on ways that we can minimise harm to our Taonga species through the sort of drain clearance mahi. This then led on to working with Te Wai Māori, looking at the good management plans that are out there for this kind of practice and what that means, which has then flowed on to trying to make this information more accessible for our communities, for our whānau, for people that own land that has drains on it, or people that work in drain clearance, and that has resulted in the brochure or booklet that you had in your bags today. All right, so what is a modified waterway or a drain? So these are small streams and rivers that historically have been heavily straightened and deepened to provide a drainage function to land. So to clear water, reduce the risk of flooding. Some of the smaller drains are often a result of converting wetland to more productive lands as well. And because of this drainage function that they now have, they're often considered more of an infrastructure than a waterway, and often thought to have little ecological value. However, they have huge ecological importance. They're home to many of our Taonga species. They provide a permanent fish habitat for over 20 of our native fish species, and drains in Aotearoa have been found to have similar fish community structures to nearby waterways that are in their natural state. They can often provide important habitat when the surrounding waterways are not in their natural state as well. They've been found to be migration corridors for most of our native species that migrate, and also home to a wide range of invertebrates. They're home to our really culturally treasured species, tuna, inanga, and also to really threatened species, so roundhead galaxid, golem galaxid, what else have we got? These species are considered nationally critical, and also species that are really vulnerable to climate change, so kanakana, and banded kōkupu. So what is drain maintenance? Well, drainage of the drains becomes an issue due to the sediment and nutrients entering the waterway. So this fuels the aquatic plant growth, it traps the sediment, and it reduces the ability of that waterway to drain the land. To maintain the drainage function of these places, waterway or drain clearance is often needed to continue them having that drain function. So the different methods that are used to clear these drains are hand weeding, so people go along and weed out the aquatic growth in the waterways. It's a very labour-intensive method and can only be used in small areas. There's the chemical control, so that's using herbicides in the water or the riparian edges and killing the growth like that. That then often leads to other issues of sediment build-up from this material staying in that waterway. So the most common practice is mechanical clearance, using diggers to scoop everything out. Mechanical clearance is a very common activity. There's little control throughout the country on this practice, and it can be done by regional or territorial authorities and landowners. In some regions, this can occur over huge stretches of waterways. So in Murihuku, Southland, there's over 5,000 kilometres of waterway that are considered modified, highly modified waterways. And so drain clearance is a permitted activity. So the impacts on Taonga species, this is a really, invasive process. The effect of there's stranding, injury and mortality to a range of different species, increased suspended sediment and reduced water clarity in those waterways, and the downstream movement and deposition of sediments downstream and into those really sensitive lower catchment environments. Damage to the bank vegetation and the structure, removal or crushing of the eggs and the larvae, and loss and degradation of the physical habitat. It also impacts their habitat, so it can cause localised extinctions, impacts on mahinga kai, and loss of the ecological function, community structure and diversity. So there are a large range of good management practices on this practice out there. A number of different regional councils have them available. So they're intended to support good management practice and to minimise the harm to these taonga species. Many of the mitigation practices suggested rely on the mobility of species, so are often not for those little invertebrates like kikiwai or koura. And best practice can still not completely avoid the loss and destruction of habitat. So the next few slides, I just go over some of the main impacts of drain clearance and then the mitigations that are suggested and some of the implementation issues that arise with those. So the stranding, damage and death of freshwater species. Some of the mitigations are to conduct fish recovery, so that involves a team of people following the digger down and kind of pulling out what they can of the spoil. Using a weed rake in the hard bottom drone, so that's allowing the fish to hopefully escape, or leaving the bucket submerged for a while before it's scooped out. So again, focusing on that species mobility to exit. And distributing the spoils so that species like tuna can make it back to the waterway. This is obviously a really challenging practice. It is highly beneficial and really recommended, although it is challenging. There's a really high mortality on hot days, so you've got to work really quick. Multiple passes are needed from a team that knows what they're looking for as well. And the effectiveness of the fish that are put back into those waterways is not very well understood in Aotearoa. Suspended sediment. So some of the mitigation practices are to place the spoil away from the waterway so the sediment's not going back in. And this is in contrast with the previous mitigation measure, which was to put it close by the waterway so the tuna could come in. Minimising the downstream sediment transport. Using a heavy bottom bucket to make sure that all the sediment is being removed, recovering distressed fish that are still in that waterway and having a bucket or some kind of pool for them to go in and be moved further upstream, and not removing the bank vegetation. So it's really important to mitigate the impacts of sedimentation because that can impact on all the aquatic life. And fish recovery often requires specialised equipment and people undertaking that work. Habitat loss. So some of the mitigations are to leave vegetation, riparian and in-stream, to install artificial fish refuges, avoid clearing entire waterways, so leaving bits of habitat there, retaining specific habitat if there is sort of important places in those streams, and avoid removing the stony substrate on the bottom, and also maintaining some variability in the stream bed. So some of the issues with implementation is that while these measures are again really helpful, they have limitations for fully preserving the habitat and minimising the disturbance. Reduced frequency is often one of the best practices, so the less time you spend in there disturbing it, the less impact it has. And artificial fish refuges are again not well understood in their impacts. So disturbances to the spawning habitat. So you can avoid doing drain maintenance during spawning season or spawning times, but again that is likely species specific, and the timing that you choose will, I guess, depend on what species is most important for you at that time, as a range of species have a range of different requirements, and I'm not sure where the gap would be to be getting in there at the right time. There also needs to be year-round protection of inanga spawning habitat. So some of the issues with implementation is that damage to habitat can occur year-round, and although they might be spawning at a certain time, they will still need that habitat to be there when it gets to spawning time. And identifying spawning habitat often requires someone with knowledge of that area and what they're looking for as well. So this is an example of Greater Wellington Regional Council's good management practice. So they have a booklet, and then at the very back is this little checklist, which I thought would be nice to include because it kind of really simplifies it and makes it accessible to say if you were out cleaning a drain, that you could just have this little checklist and get tips for improving that practice. So really, a sustainable approach to drain management requires a long-term view, and it's really about reducing the need for frequent clearance by enhancing ecosystem resilience and natural processes. So some of the key strategies to include for this include addressing the land-based sources of sediment and nutrients entering those waterways, increasing the riparian vegetation to provide shade to limit the growth within these waterways again, and restoring the natural form of these streams. So there has been quite a lot of research in the last few years in New Zealand. A lot of it has been based around te waihora, and they've been looking at things like on-farm practices and reducing those nutrients and sediment impacts into the waterways. Also a two-stage channel, which kind of looks like that instead of just like this, and a range of other methods. And they've created, I think it's a catchment-wide plan for that area. So it'll be good to see how that progresses. So, gone over that. So this is our little booklet that we've created. It was definitely a real privilege to be involved with the Te Wai Māori Trust organising this and creating this, and it's awesome to see the finished result. And yes, hopefully it can be used to help people understand that these drains, which may not mean a whole lot to them at that point in time, are actually home to our really important taonga. And that, yeah, just giving more a spotlight on the importance of these places and what they do and what they mean for us. So yeah, that was everything from me. I'm sure if there's questions later, there'll be time. Thank you.